Hey everyone, Mr. Weinland here with section 2 as we're talking about the age of exploration. We're going to get more into what happened as these new countries went out and trying to find the Northwest Passage. They obviously didn't find it, but when they did find these new places, what did they do? Well, there was conquests and colonies. So either they basically would conquer and then they would establish a colony, and we're going to talk about that. So let's start with Spain. Spain was definitely one of the first to build an empire. We see that a lot of their colonization is in hopes of building a big, huge empire. They're growing, they're becoming this power in Europe, and they want to be successful. And the best way to do that is to be successful in the Americas. And they figured if they can be one of the first to build their major empire, then they can control Europe and definitely control prices and really add to their wealth. So we see eventually they're going to conquer native empires. They're going to take on the Aztecs and the Incas, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So Spain and the Caribbean, obviously with Columbus, they definitely settled there in the Caribbean islands. We see Hispaniola, Cuba. So they were very successful there. We see that Columbus had hoped to find gold, didn't find gold. We do see that this ultimately creates what is known as the economida system, or it's a form of a economic system with the colonies. And so we see that the Spanish are building this economida. And so what the economida is that it gave colonists land and the Native Americans work. So this idea of we're going to go and colonize this land for resources, and then we're going to put people to work to get these resources and kind of create this economic system. It did require that they teach the natives about Christianity and other forms of methods. The problem that ends up happening here, and as we get to number 10 in your study guide, or your questions, excuse me, in number 10, Spanish colonization of the Americans resulted in the deaths of millions of Native Americans from what? And here comes the problem: is not only they teach them Christianity, which is okay, yeah, that's great. They're sharing the Bible and Christianity. The problem is their main reason they're not there just to share Christianity. They're there to put them to work, and this becomes a disaster for the Native Americans because they're here's part of your answer number 10. They're mistreatment, overworked, took a toll on their population. We see that Europeans spread new disease, which also killed off a big chunk of their population, because we understand, we talked about this with the Black Death. The Black Death sweeps through, bad hygiene sweeps through, has been sweeping through for centuries. So all these diseases are being spread. People are just getting sick after one another. But what is also happening is they're building up an immunity. So even though they hold these diseases and they're asymptomatic, they're spreading these diseases. Even though they're immune to them, they are unfortunately spreading these diseases to other natives. And this takes a toll on the natives because they are not immune to these diseases. And this just leads to your answer to number 15. Your answer number 15: the population of Native Americans in Spanish colonies dropped by more than what? 90%, as you can see here at the bottom. 90% of natives died in Spanish colonies because, well, one, they were overworked, but the main culprit was disease. And we're going to talk more about that later in section 3 as well. But what we do see is the age of the conquistador. We see that the Spanish are not just going in just to colonize, they're there to conquer, like I said, build the empire. And one of the first conquistadors is Hernan Cortez. Cortez is leading expeditions. He is thriving, going through Mexico, trying to build this ability to build as much of an empire as he can in South America and in other parts of the world, in the New World. So a conquistador is a military leader who fought against the Native Americans, or just a military leader, basically. That's really what a conquistador was. But they're mostly there. The conquistador is put together or created to go and conquer new lands. And so we see that Cortez is called to do that. He basically comes across Montezuma the second, And Montezuma at first thinks, okay, here are the Spanish. They're friendly. They seem like good people. We're going to be nice to them. And so they ultimately build a friendship with Cortez. And basically, what they don't realize is that Cortez is basically kind of scoping out the land and scoping out what is available, what resources are available, what can we take advantage. And even Montezuma and the Aztecs do believe that we do believe that they do see the Spanish when they first arrive as kind of like these sacred figures. The Aztecs are very powerful at this point in time when they meet up with Cortez. They rule much of Mexico. They're unpopular, though, with those that they conquered. And that leads to your answer to number 12. So some Native Americans helped Cortez because of what? The Aztecs were unpopular with those they conquered. And that is pretty much true. So Cortez joined by the thousands of those who wanted to defeat the Aztecs. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that we do see that the Aztecs become a little bit vulnerable, especially Montezuma. In addition to the Native American allies, Cortez had more, what made him successful against the Aztecs is that he had more weapons. He had armor, guns, horses, animals that the Aztecs or Americans had never seen, plus disease. And so this allowed him to conquer the Aztec Empire. It made him very successful. So on November 8th of 1519, Cortez basically enters the Aztec capital. We see that Cortez and Montezuma are greeting each other. There's respect there. What we understand, though, is the Spanish soon decide that we're going to finally finally figured out the Aztecs here. We know what they have. We know what we want, and they take Montezuma and they kidnap him and they make him their prisoner. This causes chaos. This causes panic because the people are first a little weary of the Spanish for Montezuma allowing them in there. Now he's taken under hostage as they're stealing many of the goods, the treasures that they have. And ultimately, what ends up happening is Cortez is trying to get out of there. He's trying to leave with what he has, what treasures they find. And he sends Montezuma out to basically calm down the people who are furious and upset. And ultimately, what this leads is the people killing Montezuma, throwing things at him, and he falls to his death. And ultimately, the Cortez and his people leave, and they're able to get out of the capital. However, months of heavy fighting do follow. We do see eventually Cortez is going to go back into the city with more resources, more reinforcements, and eventually he defeats the Aztec Empire and claims it for Spain. We see more conquistadors go out and try to conquer many parts of what is now Mexico and as well South America. One of those was Francisco Pizarro, which is your answer to number 13. Who was a conquistador? Francisco Pizarro was one, and that's what you need to write for number 13, as you can see there. 10 years after the conquest of the Aztecs, we see Pizarro comes in leading an expedition to Peru. He is going to take on the Incas in hopes of taking their wealth and their empire. And we see the Inca Empire already weakened by smallpox, which that was one of the diseases that was being carried by the Europeans, has killed many. And ultimately, what helps is a civil war breaks out, and Pizarro is able to conquer that part of the world. In 1532, a new ruler Atahualpa agreed to meet with the Spanish. Pizarro demanded that Atahualpa accept Christianity and hand over the empire to Spain. We ultimately see some pushback here, and then eventually Atahualpa is killed and destroyed is the Inca army, and the Spanish take over. We do ultimately see that this is going to lead to our answer to number 14, as I write it right here, out number 14. We see that life in the Spanish Empire with Mexico and Peru in the Spanish hands, we see that they have a huge chunk of the Americas. And we do see that the Spanish king chose officials called viceroys or governors to look after these holdings. Mostly the Spanish Colony economy was based on gold, silver mining, and farming. So your answer to number 14 is right here. Spanish colony economy based on gold, silver mining, and farming. The Spanish drafted Native Americans for labor, for their farms, and for their mines. Eventually, this is going to lead to the beginning of slavery. So, number 9, did the Portuguese enslave Native Americans? The answer is yes. So, it wasn't just the Spanish. We do see that disease becomes a big problem for the native population, killing 90% of them. Some appalled at their treatment. We see that with the disease and the mistreatment of the natives, there's one reformer, Bartolome de las Casas. He actually recommends Native Americans as laborers with imported African slaves. And here's the thing that bothers me is I hate to call this guy a reformer because instead of just being like, hey, let's stop mistreating these people. They're dying of disease. We're mistreating them and they're dying of that because of our mistreatment. Instead of just stopping slavery altogether and sending in workers from Spain or hiring these individuals, what ends up happening? Oh, we're just going to go and capture new people from Africa and make them slaves. And that's the problem here in this. It's very hard to call this individual reformer because he doesn't really get rid of slavery. He just basically replaces these native slaves who are dying off because of mistreatment and disease and just replaces them with Africans, and which is awful, which ends up happening. As we're going to talk more about this in section 3, I believe. But the slave labor does eventually become a big issue and becomes part of their solution to replace those who eventually go in there. Take that back. I believe it's going to be section 4 that we will talk about slavery. The Portuguese in Brazil. The Portuguese built an empire in the Americas built because of a treaty. Their empire was not as large as the Spanish one. We see in this treaty of the Spanish, in the Treaty of Tordesillas, they basically realized the Portuguese are right now on the same level as them, and they're trying to prevent the Portuguese from growing in South America because the Spanish want to grow South America. So they come up with this plan that everything east would be the Portuguese, and only Brazil would remain as a Portuguese colony, because the Spanish realized, hey, Brazil is right here. So if anything east is for Portugal. Well, Brazil is pretty much the only thing east of South America, where all of this is west, and that allowed the Spanish to get more land. And so Portugal kind of eventually was kind of got the raw end of the deal there, and that caused some issues. But we do see that gained control for the Spanish in the West. We do see, though, that the Portuguese do use Brazil to their advantage. The jungles were used for mining. We see the Portuguese were in no hurry to settle. They were just there to get resources. And by 1530, we see more colonists were there to move in. They established huge farming estates, as in Spanish lands, and first used Native Americans, then African slaves for their farms. We do eventually see silver and gold as being mined in the Americas. This is popular for Europe and their countries. Leaders in France, England, and the Netherlands decided that they needed to establish colonies in the Americas as well. And we see France is one of the very first to go and establish a colony and go colonize. We see a lot of French explorers establish colonies in what is Canada. After they just explored that and found that, they hoped that they would find rich sources in gold and silver. They couldn't find those riches, but found other potential valuable trade goods for traders. So your answer number 8 is traders right here. Here you go, traders. So you want to write that down for number 8. We do see that also your answer to number 16 is right here in these two answers. Through the waters of the North Atlantic, they found plenty of fish as part of their staple European diet. So that's part of number 16 right there, as far as some of the resources that they found. So their economy was based on fish and also valuable furs, which is right here. So fish and furs are your answer to number 16. The French did not send large numbers of colonists or traders. They did not enslave Native Americans. They only sent a selective few of hunters who would work with the Native Americans to help find the sources that they needed for trading. And ultimately, there was some intermingling with the cultures because that's how friendly they were. A few French explorers headed south. We do see they claim certain other parts of Canada. Quebec is founded in 1608. French also explored the Mississippi River, which then led to New Orleans to be discovered. We also see they go and float, find trying to find a Northwest Passage to the Pacific. Cannot find that, but they found other routes, other rivers throughout North America. In 1682, Rene Robert LaSalle canoed down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, claimed enormous can't read right now. Mississippi region as port for France, and named that area Louisiana, and basically named it after King Louis the 14th. Louisiana means land of Louis, if you did not know that. So some trade interests. The Dutch came into North America, interested in trade. Only large colony, New Netherland in Hudson River Valley. We talked a little bit about that in section 1. We see in 1626, a governor was brought to the island off of Manhattan. We see they founded the city of New Amsterdam, later becoming New York City. So the Dutch creating the settlement known as New Netherlands, becoming New York City. We see eventually a growth in the Americas. New Netherlands did not grow as large as they had thought. The Dutch did focus on developing more colonies part of the world, but other colonies were a little bit more profitable then. There were some more valuable goods that would be found in the area in Europe and the Americas. The Caribbean provided sugar. Asian spices more valuable, though, but sugar was a valued commodity. We do see the English come in, and so right around this time, establishing colonies in 1607. We see Jamestown was one of the first. It was unsuccessful at first, but eventually, once we see tobacco is introduced into Jamestown, they are successful. We do see that settlers had hoped to find gold and silver, not successful. One of the reasons why Jamestown was not so good is the ground was not pure enough, the water wasn't good, and we see that they lost a lot of lives. But and eventually it got so bad that some people were killed because they tried to eat other individuals. But like I said, Jamestown prevailed thanks to tobacco. Also, the Pilgrims came in 1620, landing in what is known as Massachusetts, in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And so Pilgrims had been persecuted in England, mostly came for religious freedom. They established the colony of Plymouth, Massachusetts, persevered despite difficulties. They had some troubles, but luckily the natives helped save them and worked with them and provided food for them, and they prevailed, and within 5 years made it self-sufficient. The Native Americans were helpful to some. English settlers did not share the same relationship with the Native Americans as the French and the Dutch, though. Jamestown, Plymouth, we do see colonies received aid from some of the locals, where others did not appreciate the natives and saw some distrust, some anger. We do see that this would lead to some problems. So ultimately, some conflict with the English ran with some conflict with the French. By the mid-1700s, the English colonists attempted to settle in French territory in the upper Ohio River Valley. This tension broke out into a war known as the French and Indian War. Both had Native American allies. The English called it the French and Indian War. We do see that the war began badly for the British. We do see the French had more soldiers than the English, but eventually British turned the tide and took the city of Quebec and won that war. Your answer to number 17 is there. Basically, what you want to write for 17 is that the French and Native Americans were mostly against the British. But yes, the British did have some Native Americans help them, but mostly it was the French and the Native Americans. This was a costly war eventually, though. It did cost a lot more money, even though they did take over a lot of territory from the French. They had to spend a lot of tax money, and a lot of this money frustrated Parliament and the king. And so in order to pay for it, they charged the colonists who had already established their colonies there in North America. And we do see that this, because of the taxation on the colonies here, this would ultimately lead to the American Revolution because they were not being well represented in England. And so with no taxation, no taxation without representation, it was basically the theme by the colonists, because they were calling for representation in Parliament, and if without that, they were not going to pay the taxes, and that led to the American Revolution. All right, so we've got 2 more sections. We've got section 3 coming up. Going to talk about trade, and then section 4 we will talk about the tragedy of slavery and how that occurred in the New World. But that's going to do it for section 2. Continue to fill out your questions and definitely email me if you can at winelandp@manford.k12.ok.us if you have any questions. All right, look out for section 3. See you guys.